Hi again. Let's finish off our sort of expanded quick tour through the last of the second half of the cranial nerve. So we'll start with number 7, the facial nerve. So it is a mixed nerve carrying both sensory and motor. And keep in mind there are several types of motor. So just to run through the bullets, this nerve passes through the internal acoustic meatus, so you should be able to identify that on a skull. There's a slide coming up that gives you practice. There are somatic efferents, so efferents are motor fibers. They're going out, away from the CNS, to all muscles of facial expression and the buccinator muscle, which we've already talked about. And those exit through the stylomastoid foramen. So again, you should be able to identify that opening on the skull and tell what nerve passes through it, which would be a branch of the facial. Number 7, there are parasympathetic fibers that are also carried in the facial nerve. Some going to the lacrimal gland. These are our parasympathetic pathways that we just did and you've been practicing. And they go via the greater petrosal nerve to the pterygopalatine ganglion. So the greater petrosal nerve is carrying the preganglionic fibers. Postganglionic fibers run from the pterygopalatine ganglia up to the lacrimal gland, and they run with or travel through or via these other branches of different cranial nerves. So they first travel with the zygomatic nerve of V2 and then the lacrimal nerve of V1. Again, we'll come back to this and do it again when we delve back into more detail with the facial nerve when we're done. There are also parasympathetic fibers to the sublingual and submandibular salivary glands that you've also practiced. And those involve the chorda tympani, which is a branch of the facial nerve. And it carries fibers of the facial nerve and the submandibular ganglion. So that you've practiced. So there are the 3 motor: somatic motor and parasympathetic motor, and then the sensory, carrying fibers for taste from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. And those fibers also travel through this little tiny cord. And that little tiny cord, or chorda, runs right across the eardrum. So it's called a little cord across the eardrum, the chorda tympani. So, again, more later. So, moving on. Number 8, the vestibulocochlear nerve, and it's sensory only. So we've done all of the sensory nerves, 1, 2, and 8. And make sure that you read the caption at the bottom, and it just reviews the fact that this is 2 nerves, basically. The vestibular portion is coming from here, and this is for balance. And the cochlear portion is coming from the cochlea, sensory only, and this is for hearing. So, not much to that. Next slide, I think, gives us a little practice on locating it. Yeah. So just recognize, we're looking down in the middle cranial fossa of the skull. Get yourself oriented. Here is there are 2 nerves here. It's a little small, so you may have to enlarge this on your computer. But here is the facial nerve. And it's embedded in the petrous portion of the temporal bone, but they've sort of removed that in the illustration to show what's deep to it, which is the cranial nerve 7. And it is passing out through this internal acoustic meatus. And there is also number 8, which is the vestibulocochlear nerve, which is also passing out of the internal acoustic meatus. So those two nerves together exit through the internal, or pass through the internal acoustic meatus, which of course is about here. Okay, what else is on this figure? Well, you should be able to identify these openings that you see. So there's an opening that you should be able to identify. Here's another one. And there's another one here. So you have those three in a row. And then you have this one. So that's kind of a tricky one because it's not really there in life. And then you also have this one. Oh, and I suppose you could also do this one since we're at it. Notice that this large white irregular opening is sort of the exit of what looks like a little roller trough. It's like you could roll a marble through there. And this is the location of the sigmoid dural sinus. We'll come back to that when we deal with the vascular system, so don't worry about it right now, but it's here. So, not signal, but sigmoid. Sigmoid for S-shaped. And it is a dural sinus formed by dura mater of the brain, and it's carrying, it's draining blood, venous blood from the cranium. And that then flows into the internal jugular. But we'll come back to that, so don't worry about it right now. That's probably enough of this slide. Let's move on. Just another quick picture of the vestibulocochlear nerve showing the two branches. Shows the cochlear root, and then not highlighted is the vestibular root. So it makes the vestibulocochlear nerve. Going into the brainstem, and this of course is the pons. You already knew that. This would be the medulla oblongata. You already know that. So let's move on. The ninth cranial nerve is glossopharyngeal. It is mixed also, both motor and sensory. So some of this should be looking familiar. We have visceral motor to the parotid salivary gland. And then you are able to describe the motor pathway. So visceral motor is parasympathetic. Visceral for internal organs. So that's also on a homework assignment. And we also have general sensation. So this is sensory for posterior, for general sensation and taste. So general sensation would be to put your finger on it, pressure, touch, that sort of thing. And for taste from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. So who handled taste for the anterior 2/3? All right, facial nerve. So this is the glossopharyngeal. It also carries visceral sensory from the carotid sinus. You know where that is? It's where the common carotid bifurcates into the internal and the external carotids. We talked about the internal carotid going through the carotid canal. Okay. And there are also chemoreceptors in the carotid body. So it would be really nice, although I don't think I'm going to test you on this, if you remembered the baroreceptor reflex. Probably one of the more important neural reflexes that we discussed with the cardiovascular system last quarter. Okay, so we're just doing a quick tour of the cranial nerve. So there's number 9. And oh, another picture of 9. You may want to zoom in on this. It's kind of neat. Here's your pathway. But you really have to look at it with maybe a magnifying glass or enlarge it on your computer. But we're going to, this is showing that parasympathetic pathway to the parotid salivary gland. So there's our otic ganglion up by the ear, and the preganglionic neuron there is also being shown, as you just follow it along, the lesser petrosal nerve. Okay, so that's probably enough for this diagram, because all I asked you to do was just to be able to trace that 2-neuron pathway. Okay, and the openings for this nerve, by the way, get a little complicated, because it enters the skull, leaves the skull, re-enters the skull, and then leaves it. So I'm not doing that detail. Because what you'll see if you pay attention to this illustration is that here comes this lesser petrosal, and it's exiting through the foramen ovale, right? But when we talked earlier about how these nerves exit the cranium, 9, 10, and 11 were exiting through the jugular foramen. So let's not get buried or tangled up in the weeds here. We'll just stick with 9, 10, and 11. They do exit the skull through the jugular foramen. This nerve just re-enters again, but let's not worry about that. So let's move on. Vagus nerve, it's the wanderer. It's the vagabond, how it got its name, both sensory and motor. So it exits the jugular foramen, carries both sensory and parasympathetic, so there's our sensory and our motor, so it's mixed, and both sensory and motor to the heart, bronchioles, viscera. So the vagus nerve carries both sensory fibers from this, and it also carries parasympathetic fibers. So there's sensory going to the brain, and there is motor, parasympathetic, back to the viscera. That's the idea. Okay. Moving on. The accessory is motor only. It's accessory to the vagus. But what I would like you to know about this nerve is that there are 2 roots from the CNS. There are the cranial roots and the spinal roots, and both exit through the jugular foramen. So it looks sort of something like this. It's not shown really well, but here's the idea. If this is the brainstem and the medulla, sort of something like this, and here is the foramen magnum, for mag, And this is the brain stem. The cranial roots come off something like this. I'll draw them in red. They're coming off here. Something like that. That's where they attach on both sides. And then you also have spinal roots. I'll just draw those in a different color. They're coming off here. So once we pass through the foramen magnum, we're now in the cranium. And those then merge, into this accessory nerve. And then that goes off and exits through the jugular foramen. That's red and blue, so it's so this is the jugular foramen. And this nerve goes to these two effectors, the trapezius and the SCM, which is shown nicely in the drawing. Okay? So that's the accessory. Motor only has a cranial root from inside the cranium and a spinal root from the spinal cord. Okay, and the last one is 12, the hypoglossal. Motor only again. And carries somatic motor fibers. So somatic, these are voluntary skeletal muscles, to all of the intrinsic and all of the extrinsic muscles of the tongue. So the diagram on the right lower is showing some of these extrinsic tongue. Well, it's showing there's the styloglossus, the hyoglossus, and the genioglossus. And the figure at the top right is showing what happens when there's a problem with one of the two genioglossus muscles. So in figure B, both muscles are working together. The origin is on the genial tubercles. The insertion is on the tongue. And when the muscle contracts, it pulls the tongue forward equally. If one of the muscles is paralyzed, there's a lesion in the nerve to that muscle, then the other one dominates, and as it pulls the tongue forward, it's kind of pulling it in this direction, and the tongue veers off to the left. So the left muscle was paralyzed, tongue deviates to the weak side. Okay. And that was it. We'll stop here, and the next lecture will be on the trigeminal nerve, and then we'll take a break or another break in the lecture series, and then we'll do the facial. So, see you soon. Bye.